It's an age-old question, reform or revolution? Or to put it another way, can welfare states be a laboratory for social change? It's the topic of this episode of PEP Talk.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Hello and welcome to PEP Talk, the Participatory Economy Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as the participatory economy. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepanczyk, coming from Chicago. I am joined by two guests. One joining us from Portland, Oregon in the United States is Robin Hahnel.
Good to be with you.
And joining us as well from Helsinki, Finland is Antti Jauhiainen.
Yeah, glad to be here.
And the topic of this episode of PEP Talk is welfare states. And they're serving as a kind of not laboratory and maybe also launchpad for possible better economies. I'll say this to just get started on this. There's a book that actually kind of talks about similar issues regarding welfare states, as well as reason why they've been opposed so much. This having to do with austerity. The book is called The Capital Order by Clara Mate. The subtitle, How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. An eerily prescient book for our current day and age. But it kind of also leads to, with regards to welfare states and being a launchpad for a better economy. And I guess that kind of makes sense. When people are too busy, like trying to make sure that they have, enough food to eat and enough money to be able to pay for living expenses, they're not exactly going to be worrying about, maybe I should strive for a better economy. And that kind of might be the underpinning here. Robin, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, on the left, this has always been discussed as reform versus revolution. Mm-hmm. And on the far left, the goal and the answer is always revolution. And then sometimes the attitude is, well, reform is a distraction. Or if the system is reformed, there's two arguments that the far left has had about, sort of social democratic, what in Europe are called social democratic, reforms. Well, one is that to the extent that they're successful, they diminish the appetite for, overthrowing the system and having revolutionary system change.
Right.
So if they're successful, then they have a bad effect. And then the other argument is, well, they don't make any difference anyway. That, the amount of improvement that they provide is so minimal and negligible as not to be worth fighting for. I think both of those attitudes that some on the far left have had over, more than a century now are just wrong and quite counterproductive. But I think that's what we're going to talk about a little.
Yeah. Antti, as someone who lives in what some people around the world will refer to as a welfare state, what are your thoughts with regards to this matter, especially as you having worked on questions with regards to economics and economic system change? What's your take?
Yeah, actually, the way I got acquainted with Robin's work was through his book, Economic Justice and Democracy, mm-hmm. Where Robin devotes a lot of pages to discussing welfare states, a lot of it referencing a guy called Magnus Reiner, actually, and the changes that were made to the Finnish and Swedish economies in the 1950s and so on, after the Second World War. I think welfare states in general are important because their success, I think especially in Finland, are sort of proof that, for example, democratically managed state ownership can work very well, and wide public services can work very well. And the kind of stuff that gets argued, for example, in the United States constantly, we're way past that. Instead, of course, Finland has very similar, and especially in age where, ideas and stuff move really fast. A lot of sort of memeing, so that, Finnish politics copy stuff from United States politics, and then our political people just try to do the same things. And that's sort of the reality of the world we live in. But when you look at our systems, for example, I think Venezuela would, dream of having the kind of wide state ownership systems that Finland, Sweden, and Norway have. Our state ownership levels are much higher than Venezuela has, for example. And the same goes for a lot of third world countries. And that's why I think the left is unwise to disparage welfare states. And one of the things why welfare states, I think, show their strength is that there has been considerable attempts to really change our model, to get us in vogue with the neoliberal order. And a lot of bad stuff has happened. This is something that gets debated in Finland quite a lot, and for a good reason. The support for families is getting lower, and public schools where I work, for example, are seeing very bad situation with our funding. But it's still galaxies away from the kind of situation that, for example, the United States has. And that's why I think it would be important. I've co-authored book, Welfare State Strikes Back, with Joona Hermanni-Mäkinen, where we, for example, interview Robin and several other people from the United States, precisely to discuss the differences between, for example, the United States or even Great Britain have compared to what Finland and Sweden have. But when it comes to discussing system change, I think the realistic point of view is that it's very hard to progress towards very advanced democratic radical economies without first achieving the kind of stuff that we fought for after the Second World War, namely large public ownership, wide public services, and, for example, free education. This is something that, my friends in the United States never sees, being flabbergasted by, that in Finland, university studying is free. There's no fees for it. And actually, we have a system that keeps getting chipped away by every right-wing government every time they're in power. But there's student support. So students actually receive money for studying at the university. And that kind of stuff is just a major achievement. And I think it paves the way. It's much better situation when to start building, for example, maybe publicly owned cooperatives that have democratic workplace structures, or have taxation systems that are much more nuanced and take care of, individual industries and their situation. All that is much, or not even going to environmental regulation. All of that is much easier to do within a welfare state than without.
All this talk actually brings to mind an op-ed that was published in the New York Times in the United States, with the headline, actually published the week we are recording this, from September 25th, 2023, a guest essay entitled "America Pulled Children Out of Poverty. Now it's set to reverse course with a vengeance," written by an author, Nikhil Goyal, talking about how during the pandemic, the United States, for once, actually expanded the social safety net in the United States, and with great success. A great many children who were in poor circumstances for the last couple of years were not in poor circumstances, and it really has been a boon. And by the end of this month, September 2023, it's all going to end. According to one estimate, 3.2 million American children are expected to lose access to care in the coming months for things like rental assistance, allotment of food, coverage of medical care. And it's probably just all going to end just simply because, and then kind of going back to the point regarding austerity, well, we have to, keep our money in flowing for the people that matter and not for poor people. So sorry, your ride is over. The pandemic is done. Robin, as a fellow American, what are your thoughts with regards to what we're seeing here, especially in seeing the policy and also vis-a-vis system change?
Well, I mean, I would just start with, not all versions of capitalism are equally horrific. Mm-hmm. And anybody on the left who, argues or thinks that social democratic capitalism is not vastly superior in terms of its performance for, the people in that economy than the current version of neoliberal capitalism, is just out of touch with reality. And I think we'll have a very hard time dealing, interacting sensibly with ordinary people if you try and tell them that. So that's my starting point, that when I take a look at, what it was that the Swedish or the Finnish economy was accomplishing and what they were doing in the late 1950s, 60s up until the early 70s, there really was a turning point, in the Scandinavian economies in the mid to late 70s, where there had been a rapid increase in social democratic programs. People should understand this includes high levels of taxation. To do what? To fund public education for everybody, right? Free of charge up through the university. So there's sort of a basic choice about, well, how much do we tax for these services? And that's one critical part of what social democracy has been about. But in any case, there's a huge difference, and the difference is worth fighting for. The left has a hard time with this because the left wants to say, social democratic capitalism is still a market system. Now, the markets are much more regulated. The markets are much more tamed. The financial industry is much more, and that's why it works better. But it's still a market system. And while the percentage of publicly owned enterprises may be significantly larger, and I love the example that there was more public ownership in the social democratic economies in Scandinavia than there was in, that communist Chavez, economy in Venezuela. So yes, there's more public ownership and there's more regulation, but the economy is still majority private enterprise. So it's still a private enterprise market economy. And for all of us who believe there's a better way, that a planned economy and democratic planning and social ownership is superior to private ownership in markets, well then, of course, social democracy falls short of what we think would be an even better and qualitatively superior economic system. On the other hand, there's a tendency for people who are anti-capitalist to belittle the extent to which there's a huge difference. Now, you could argue, and one of the things that I've always found interesting, I have I have many comrades, over decades. And the way that far leftists sometimes deal with this problem is they distinguish between what are called revolutionary reforms and just sort of mere reforms. That somehow there are some sort of reforms that take us forward that don't have that undermine the system, and that those are the reforms that we should support, as opposed to other forms that don't undermine the system. And to some extent, there's a little bit of truth to that. But in my view, what it comes down to is sort of a leftist has to convince themselves to do the right thing, which is to pitch in and help fight to win reforms of the capitalist system to make capitalism less neoliberal and more social democratic. And I just think that's a part of the reality that we have to be able to say two things. We have to be able to say these reforms really do improve people's lives. And if you want to talk to real people and involve real people, then you have to support these reforms and be working very hard for their success. Don't belittle them. Don't stand on the sidelines and say they make no difference. And then the second thing you have to be able to say is, but we can do far better. One last thing on the subject. One of the problems, and I think this is the history of the Scandinavian economies, is an excellent sort of confirmation of this, if you keep winning social democratic reforms, but you leave the private enterprise market system in place, you are always at risk of things going back in the other direction. Well, social democracy is sort of a gradual movement in a progressive direction. Well, what we've seen in the Scandinavian countries is precisely that. Well, that's not the only direction things can move, because for the most part, they've been moving exactly back in the more neoliberal capitalist direction for the past 20 years in those Scandinavian economies. Well, why did that happen? And it happened essentially because as long as you leave private enterprise and the market system in place, you have a fertile ground for where it is that the forces, the business interests in the business sector and the forces that want, and the wealthier people who don't want to be taxed at the level that's paying for free university for kids from poorer families, you leave a political system in effect that allows for them to take you back in that direction. So that's what's wrong with social democracy is it's a halfway system, and it can go either direction. Yeah. You can continue to improve it, but it can also sort of it can also slide back when the political fortunes should shift to some extent.
Yeah, Swedish author Per Molander has a great book called The Anatomy of Inequality. And he discusses in that book how capitalist societies, and he takes a lot of examples from history and how capital itself affects societies in exactly the way that Robert described, that private accumulation of capital is this sort of disease in societies that it starts, amassing wealth. And he shows a lot of examples from game theory and how easy it is to prove that without regulation, without institutions, the whole thing will run itself down in record time. That's why there has always been different systems for, managing the wealth, for managing it, that it doesn't spiral out of control. And I think welfare states, and Per Molander makes the same point, welfare states are one of the most advanced ones. They are a very great way of doing it. And I don't see this reformism so much that I think it's recognizing the inherent need for anti-capitalism. It's recognizing that capitalism is a system that constantly needs this sort of stewarding. And that's precisely because it is so flawed. And I don't think radicals should have any problem with that. That's what we do. And then, us radicals should be there standing, that's what happens with the economic system. We must keep the, screws really tight, and we get better results when we manage it more and more and more, and we should do that democratically. So that's, I think the lesson from welfare states, that it's a good thing to regulate capital, and we should do it democratically.
Yeah, you could see this kind of oscillation between, forces to try to tamp down capital and try to improve a social safety net that I think are right now, you could say, are kind of in the ascendancy. I mean, there's of course, it's like you could say that that's, it depends on the country and it depends on the circumstance. My read of it is I think that we're what had been called neoliberalism for the last 40 years or so. I think, and my read of it is that it's probably on the downswing to some extent. And it would be right now where you would think that social reform efforts are on the upswing. And but the thing is that won't necessarily stay. In fact, in a Capital Order, they actually talk about how in the years immediately after the First World War, 1918 to 1920, were referred to as the Red Years repeatedly in the book, because there were massive, strong efforts to carry through with political reforms, radical reforms, or very radical proposals that were on the table, or in some cases being implemented or trying to be implemented. And they had to basically be not only beaten down, but also that fostered the kind of austerity model that's actually still in play now, where basically it's like, okay, we got to make sure that these folks don't try to organize an uprising of any kind, how do we do that? Well, we'll basically starve them. And that's basically what austerity is in the regime, which basically is still in place now. I'm sure I had a question here.
Can I say something about a particular person in Sweden named Meidner?
Yes.
My understanding is that he was a very important leader of the Swedish Social Democratic Party. And he came up with a plan, and it was called the Meidner Plan. And what the Meidner Plan consisted of was very simple, but very interesting. He said, look, what we ordinarily do is the unions go out and they bargain for wage increases. And they say, okay, prices have gone up by 2 or 3%, and therefore we need to at least get a 2 or 3% raise in wages. And since our former wages weren't really fair in the first place, we deserve a bigger part of the pie, then we need to get an extra couple of percentage. He says, that's what we do. That's what unions do. That's what labor does. That's what we've been doing. We need to make one small modification of that. And this was the Meidner Plan. He said, we should also negotiate at the same time that we're getting some sort of percentage increase in wages, that the workers in that firm would also get some small share of stock, actual ownership, shares of stock as part of the wage bargain that we're negotiating for. And he basically calculated that over a period of 20 years, if you did that the majority of stock would be owned by the people working in you would have workers' ownership. You would have basically gradually replaced, absentee ownership by ownership of the enterprise by the workers that work there. That reform was debated, and this is the key thing that happened. And I'm still waiting to sort of see somebody write the definitive history of the party backed off. The Swedish Social Democratic Party said that is a step too far. We are not willing to take. We might lose an election, et cetera, and they didn't take that step. Now that would have, suppose they had done that, well, then they would have had market socialism within 20 years instead of social democratic capitalism. Some of us think that, well, the markets are still a problem and you would need it, but it would have been rather substantial and incredible.
Yeah, there's a lot of good articles. There's a Finnish researcher called Ilkka Kärrölä who is actually researching and writing about exactly that topic, and his articles are definitely worth checking out. The kind of funds that Robin talked about, the welfare funds, are that were discussed in Nordic countries. They were established, but they became just pension funds instead of public ownership funds. But they became huge. In Finland, Finland is the poorest of Nordic countries. I think the pension funds are somewhere around 250 billion euros. 250 billion euros accumulating capital year after year, and it's ridiculous the amount of wealth they have. And if that would have been that was precisely Meidner's point, that the thing with capitalism is once you put the seed money in and you manage the wealth, stuff starts to happen. Money comes to money, and that would have really changed history. But I think there might be a chance in the future of doing something similar.
I'm just finishing reading a book by Isabel Allende, who I believe is a niece of Salvador
Allende. Yep.
And this is a book that's sort of an autobiography and a personal history, but she also comments extensively about the years of the Allende government. And it's very interesting that at exactly the same time that Meidner and the Social Democratic Party was sort of struggling over their way of that the Allende government was doing the same in Chile. And they very clearly did not want to do central planning like the Cubans had done. They had invited various people down there to sort of advise them and talk about, because they already, they knew they were going to take over the mining industry. And then the question is, well, how do we run this? And how do we, we're going to have a nationalized sector, and how are we going to manage it democratically and not do it through central planning, et cetera, et cetera. So at the exact same time in history, in the mid-1970s or the early 1970s, you had both of these places sort of struggling with, we know that the centrally planned communist system doesn't work. On the political side, they clearly understood we don't want single party states, and meaningless elections, abolish elections. Part of the way history works is you don't get it right the first time. You don't win the first time. You learn some lessons and, you try again.
I remember the question I was going to ask when I gave my soliloquy regarding austerity. It's and both of you have illustrated with examples about seemingly innocuous reforms that could turn out to be very potent. But I'm just wondering, maybe the model of a participatory economy that we advocate for could also be come into the mix here. It's when people talk about, let's feed, let's make sure that the poor children that we've been subsidizing for the last 2 years because there was a deadly pandemic, and we're giving them money to make sure that they don't starve. And we're going to cut that off just simply because we always have. But fighting for that is a good thing. In the course of fighting for that, we should also say, but the reason that they're starving is because of systems that are in place that cause them to starve. And we should replace that with systems that don't cause them to starve. Here's an example. And we think it might work. We've done research on this. Here's a book that Robin and I co-wrote. Things like that.
Yeah, and we
should fight for that, I think. But Antti, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that I just counted is that we are working with utopian ideals, and democratic economy that's way far in the future. But I think what's important here and now, and this is a relevant criticism of utopias, is that they don't necessarily help here and now. That's sort of a fact. Whereas the kind of welfare reforms that welfare states have, they really help here and now. And I think it's very important to fight for those changes that help here and now without losing the touch of utopias. And I think that's something that, because oftentimes political ideas come these, battles, which one is the most important one? And I think much more fruitful way of approaching that is, showing that, they can coexist and co-work, support one another. And it's too long a topic to go into right now, but actually history of welfare states are example of that as well. It was radical idea, being catalyst for change in the economies. It was radical ideas that helped scare the capitalists in a way that, they were willing to say that, okay, let's go with the wage earner funds first, or let's go with, public school system first. We don't have to go, all democratic socialist right away. And if that interplay works smartly between reforms and, real far off utopian ideas, that's when progress gets made.
I think there's another way in which a utopian element plays an important role. So let's just think about a union that's going out on strike. And
that never happens these days.
Well, right. And this is the first time that there's been a strike against all three of the major automobile makers in the history of the Automobile Workers Union.
Yep. In the United States. Yep. They're all
I'm literally in shock. I'm literally in shock watching what's happening. I'm from
Michigan. I'm more in shock.
Well, and it's also the first time that a sitting president is going to go and walk a picket line.
Now, as we record, that is happening right now. But go on, Robin.
And So you think about it, just think about an ordinary strike. And in capitalism, the union fights for wage increases, the union fights for benefit increases. They should probably fight for certain shares of stock, sort of. But the settlement is always, going to be less than they were fighting for. And where the utopian element comes in is, I think it is important to remind people we got what we could get under the circumstances. In capitalism, we had to fight this way, and we got what we could get. But that's still not a fair wage. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if the profit rate isn't down to zero, then we didn't get everything we should have gotten. So the idea that, and you can do both things. You can fight hard for the best thing you can get and still remind yourself you deserved more. And I think that's in a sense what and the same thing is sort of holding true if it's not just a wage settlement or something like that. It's a reform of anything. It's important to remember that even when you did the best you could, until you actually change the rules, you change the system, you're inevitably not getting what you fully deserve. You're not getting full economic justice. You're not getting full economic democracy. You're not getting any of these things as long as the system stays. There's no reason you can't. It's the old, can you walk and chew gum at the same time? Right. It really is nothing different or more complicated than that.
You have been listening to or watching PEP Talk, the Participatory Economy Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. To find out more, visit the website of the Participatory Economy Project at participatoryeconomy.org. There you can join an online forum where you can discuss matters related to a participatory economy, including that discussed in this episode related to welfare states and the launchpad for better economies. You can also sign up for a regular monthly newsletter where we discuss issues and also share developments regarding the Participatory Economy Project. For Mitchell in Chicago, Robin in Portland, Antti in Helsinki, thank you very much for watching and listening. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangement.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered work, nested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory.economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.